Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on this very beautiful day here in Charlottesville. Welcome to our book talk called The Algorithm, AI, Civil Rights, and the Workplace with Hilke Schellmann. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm an assistant professor of data science and media studies here at UVA. I'm new. I came here last fall. I researched the intersection of AI and society as a sociologist. I will be your host today, or moderator, I should say. But before we get going, I want to express my sincere thanks to the UVA Department of Media Studies and the Karsh Institute of Democracy for sponsoring this event. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome my long-term collaborator, former colleague and dear friend, Hilke Schellmann, to Grounds. That means campus. Hilke is an Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter and a professor of journalism at NYU. She has a track record in impactful investigative reporting, especially on all things AI. You will learn more about that in a second. She also has many other accolades. I'm just naming a few of them. Her 2013 documentary called Outlawed in Pakistan, played at Sundance and aired at PBS Frontline, was recognized with an Emmy Award, an Overseas Press Club, and a Cinema for Peace Award, amongst other awards. Her investigation into student loans for Vice on HBO uncovered how a spy-god of easy money from the federal government is driving up the cost of higher education in the US and is threatening the country's international competitiveness. She also won an award for that, namely, she was a finalist for the Peabody Award for that. She also directed Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism video journalism program and spearheaded video coverage as a multimedia reporter for the New York section of the Wall Street Journal, where she still is a contributing journalist. Her work has appeared in many places, amongst them the New York Times, Vice, HBO, PBS, Time, ARD, ZDF, WNYC, many others. And it has been supported by foundations such as the Patrick McGovern Foundation, the MIT Knight Science Fellowship, the Pulitzer Center, AI Accountability Network, and the NYU Journalism Venture Capital Fund. Her mission, as she likes to say, is to hold AI accountable, and she really means that, let me tell you. Today, she has come here to present her new book called The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and why we need to fight back. The book is available for purchase out for a special price. Thank you to the UVA bookstore for coming out and helping us with that. In the book, she investigates the rise of AI in the world of work. So this affects all of us. She's drawing on many years of exclusive information gathering from whistleblowers, from internal documents and real-world tests. She discovers that many of the algorithms making high-stakes decisions are biased, racist, and do more harm than good. Hilke, welcome. Thank you so much.
I think Mona's trying to say I've been around the block for a few years. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I've never been at UVA, so I'm really impressed. I'm coming from a university that has no real campus in the middle of New York City, so this is quite impressive. So I wanted to talk a little bit today how it all started, and it actually, my journey. I wasn't a tech reporter. I was doing a lot of social advocacy journalism. But I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. in November 2017, and it was a conference with lots of consumer lawyers, which had nothing to do with AI, and I think they still don't know what AI is. But I needed a ride from the conference to the train station, and I called myself a Lyft, and I talked to the driver, and I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "It's been a really weird day." And, I'm a nosy reporter, so I was like, "Oh, yeah? tell me more. He probably was like a little freaked out that I was so interested. And he was like, you know what? I had a, it's a really weird day. I had a job interview with a robot. And I was like, what? A job interview with a robot? What is that? So it turned out that he had applied for a baggage handler position at a local airport. And he got a call from like some sort of robot voice. I think it was a pre-recorded voice interview. And he was asked 3 questions, but he was really freaked out. And I was like, I've never heard of this. I took a note and like, wow, like, robot interviews. That was sort of the beginning. I started to dig deeper, and I found out that there is a real wild west of hiring AI tools and lots of monitoring at work. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about that today. And I want to also talk about why I think AI in high stakes decision making, which I think is hiring and us being at work is part of that, and is one of the most important civil rights issues of our time. And I also want to empower you all to do this work with us and hold algorithms accountable. So I'm trying to, we'll talk through my methods, and I want you all to take this home, test these algorithms, and steal my methods. Because as an investigative journalist, we often say that our job is to keep the powerful accountable. But I want to change that up a little bit, because I feel now a lot of the power is held by algorithms. So we need to expand our mandate and also hold AI and other algorithmic tools accountable, since some AI tools are now making powerful decisions about humans. So I wanted to start with a couple of questions. Has any one of you here ever applied to a job platform, kind of LinkedIn, Indeed, ZipRecruiter? Yeah? AI has been used on you. All of these job platforms use some form of AI. Has anyone played like a super basic, maybe some of gamified assessment? Anyone done like a Pymetrics balloon game? Yeah. AI was used on you. Has anyone done a one-way video interview where you get like pre-recorded questions on your phone or on your desktop and you have to answer them? So that's also pretty prevalent. And I think what might be helpful to understand is like the scope of some of the AI that we see in hiring and at work. So a lot of people that I've talked to, the CEO of ZipRecruiter sort of said like, oh yeah, there's been a whole revolution. Like the robots have come and gone and no one has noticed. In November 2022, so about a year or so ago, HireVue announced that the company has done over 30 million one-way video interviews. That's a lot of interviews. We also know that 99% of Fortune 500 companies use algorithms in their hiring funnel. And almost all mid-sized to large companies in the United States have applicant tracking systems. They used to be sort of Excel sheets where, HR managers would check, okay, you did an interview, now you're in the next round, or did we reject you? And all of these applicant tracking systems have AI built in. There's no mandatory requirement that companies have to tell us what they're using. So I can tell you, what part of the tool have they turned on or off? We don't know any of that. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about surveillance at work. And again, companies don't have to report what they're using. But the New York Times found out that 8 out of 10 of the largest companies in the US monitor and survey their workers. And in a recent article, CNBC revealed that large companies, including Walmart, Delta Airlines, T-Mobile, and Chevron, Starbucks, and Nestle, they're working with a startup that is checking employee Slack, email, Zoom, Microsoft Teams for employee sentiment and infractions. So what they say is that it can identify bullying, harassment, discrimination, non-compliance, pornography, nudity, and other behaviors. And usually what happens is like if the AI finds any signals, it will be sent to HR managers or legal, who then takes a little bit of a closer look. But let me back up a little bit to the beginning now that you know the scope of all of this and what we're dealing with. So back to the cab ride. So I noted down the cab driver's number and asked him if I could call him again. But it didn't really click that this might be an important story until a few weeks later. I was at an AI fairness conference, and somebody gave a presentation who had just left the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and she gave a talk and said, I can't sleep at night because at the EEOC, we looked at some of these companies that use very basic algorithms to scroll employees' calendars and understand how long are you at your desk. And she was really worried that what might happen is that companies might start looking at people who have the longer absent times. And as we now know from the pandemic, it's often mothers who are often absent from work and people with disabilities. And those are protected classes in the United States. And she was afraid that, there might be discrimination happening. So while all of this was happening, I was freelancing for the Wall Street Journal, and I started to get to work. And I reached out to HireVue, which is one of the most dominant vendors, and asked for a demo and try to understand how does this tool work. And I brought a short excerpt because I think it's kind of helpful to understand what is in these technologies. So it's a 2-minute piece that the correspondent and I did together.
We begin our exploration of the new world of hiring with a visit to the headquarters of one of the companies that's pushing the envelope, HireVue. Its artificial intelligence assessment tool is used by over 50 companies, including Unilever and Hilton, which both declined to comment. This, I'm told, is a typical digital interview for someone applying to become a customer service rep. It confronts me with several scenarios that, on the job, I might encounter.
If you can't help me resolve this right now, I'm going to take my business elsewhere.
I'm here to try to make things better. I go into this knowing something that HireVue acknowledges many job candidates potentially do not. That my responses are being assessed not by human beings, but by AI, analyzing my tone of voice, the clusters of words I use, and my micro-expressions. So here's what's wild to me. The notion of micro-expressions, is that what you're calling them?
It's the facial analysis software. It's capturing, if you think of facial movement, smiling, frowning, eyebrow movement, those are actual database points, and they roll together to give certain emotions and traits and personality and thinking style things.
Here I am.
Yeah.
I just did the interview for a job as a customer support representative. How'd I do?
The first thing is we look at the AI score that's attached to it, and you can see that up here. You scored it at 37%.
That's pretty good, right?
No, that's out of 100, right? So you're kind of in the bottom third, if you will, in that job, so you'd be a low match, essentially. My rating is the result of HireVue's AI comparing my responses to those of actual employees. Essentially, my performance is being compared. My voice, my words, my facial expressions against a company's highest performers.
So you think if an employer were to see that number, would I be written off most likely? Or would it be filtered out of the process completely?
No, absolutely not, actually. What we would recommend is that the candidates could be rank ordered by that, but they still go and look at the different videos.
So you're telling me that everybody who goes through this, they get seen by someone?
Can be. They want to watch all the videos.
But they might
or not.
decide, hey, this guy Jason only has 37%, not even worth our time.
If you score so low, they might say we may not watch all the videos, but they may watch a question.
So a couple of things about this video. What might be of interest is that you see Nathan sort of really having a hard time saying, well, we recommend that they look at something, and I always wondered. I was like, why would companies pay thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for the software, and then they start watching all these videos if they have an AI ranking? Because a lot of companies want to use kind of screening technologies because they feel like they get overwhelmed by applications, right? We go on LinkedIn and we send, you can send 500 applications in an hour. And, large companies like Google and others get 3 million applications a year. So they feel overwhelmed. So they need a technological tool. But here you can tell Nathan is sort of trying, no, maybe a human is watching it and we recommend that. And what was interesting, and that might be helpful, is one methodology I use to hold AI accountable is I filed a lot of freedom of information requests. So in one case, HireVue worked with Atlanta Public Schools, and they used the AI software to hire teachers. So I filed a Freedom of Information request for all communication between Atlanta Public Schools and HireVue, and I found out that they did have an email exchange, and in the email exchange, Nathan actually says, we want to install a cut score. So everyone who scores under 33% gets rejected. Which is actually, when I talk to other psychologists, this is actually kind of normal. You have an assessment, so you start rejecting people, right? So the cut score is nothing out of the ordinary, but it was kind of interesting that he keeps denying that, these vendors make these decisions, like they make a ranking, they have a cut score, and people are being rejected by software. I think also of note here is that, when I first saw this, their facial expression analysis and intonation of our voices, and, I was like a bit blown away. This was like in early 2018. We were at the beginning of sort of AI in our lives. And I was like, wow, did we find a new way to hire? Did we go beyond biased human hiring? Is the machine really better at this? So for a moment, I was like, let's see. Maybe we found an AI that will do this work. And then I started looking into it, and it turns out, there isn't any science underneath this. Unfortunately, I talked to, experts are really helpful in this. I talked to psychologists who said, look, there really isn't any science on what kind of facial expressions we need to have to be successful in the job. There's certainly no science about facial expressions in job interviews to show how we will be successful in the job. And, some of the effective computing that is underneath here, where companies sort of check our faces to see, okay, there's a smile. Yes, the computer can detect it. It's actually very good at detecting that. But that doesn't mean I'm actually happy, right? If it infers an emotion, and it doesn't actually mean that I'm feeling it. And there's a lot of variability in there. So that was kind of interesting. We put that in the video, and then there was a big expose also in the Washington Post that Drew Havel wrote a couple years later that also criticized this facial expression analysis. And we were lucky that HireVue decided to phase out the facial expression analysis. And then last year, they also decided to phase out the intonation of voice analysis, which equally doesn't really have any scientific backing. So that's a good thing. So investigative journalism does have an impact. Unfortunately, HireVue has phased it out. Sometimes it feels a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole, because now there are other companies that are using it again. So it feels like, no, we just did this. We all know it's not working. Why are we using this? But that maybe just be the state of the industry. And then I also wanted to talk about a little bit, I talked to employment lawyers who get sometimes called in when a vendor wants to sell a tool to a big company, and they bring in some lawyers. And in this case, there were a bunch of employment lawyers who looked at resume screeners. So what happens when you send your resumes in? And what they found was pretty troubling. So one resume screener decided that the word Thomas is a predictor of success. Sorry to all the Thomases, your name doesn't qualify you for anything, right? It's the trades and our skills and our experience that should qualify us for a job. And in this case, Thomases got a leg up. They also found keywords like Canada and Syria as predictors of success, which, when I talk to the employment lawyers, they're like, well, that sounds like discrimination based on national origin. We don't like this. And they found things like football, basketball were also predictors of success, and the jobs had nothing to do with sports. They were just random jobs. They also found out that in one case, a resume screener gave folks who had the word basketball on their resume more points, and people who had the word softball on their resumes fewer points. So that sounds like gender discrimination in the United States, because, often more women play softball and more men play baseball. So the problem is, what probably happened is that these tools were trained on biased data from a company, right? So often these tools are trained with training data from the company. So maybe you have you hired 200, 500 people last year, and they're all on the job right now. So you give the AI tool all the resumes, and the AI tool, scans them all in and makes statistical inferences. What are the keywords that make somebody successful at this company? So if you were, tech companies often have historic biases, right? They have hired more men than women, so maybe more men have basketball on their resume. So that these tools learn, baseball is a predictor of success, basketball, and softball is not, because there are not many people here of softball on their resume. So we see this again and again, that like in something that maybe looks kind of neutral, it's like, it's a resume, everyone has the same chance, but like these kind of biased keywords come into play, and that's obviously very troubling. And I think that's one of the things that I check a lot, is when I talk to companies, I ask a lot about the training data, like how were these tools trained? And I talk about are they trained with people's resumes from your company? Do you have a diverse company? Because not, you probably have a problem if you use the resumes from current employees. There's also a thought that if you want to hire new people and have a more diverse workforce, why are you using resumes of people you hired in the past when you weren't really thinking about diversity? You might just replicate the same things people do and have. So I think also what's helpful is to question some of the accuracy numbers. I know it's really hard because a lot of AI companies say this is 80, 90% accurate. But it's really a question okay, was this tested in the wild with data from another company or from independent auditors, or is this just from your own data set? Maybe you bring 1,000 resumes, you give the computer 800 and you leave 200 out from the same training set. And if then you feed it and you have 90% accuracy, well, it's 90% accuracy on the same data. It's actually not very impressive. So I think questioning that might be helpful. Also, I kind of sometimes remember that a coin toss is 50% accuracy. So if you have anything close to 50, 60, or 70%, that's actually pretty low accuracy. So that might be something to think about. And then I have two more little things that I wanted to show. Is one of the things I did is I tested some of these tools myself. So when I talk to the vendors, they say, I'm concerned in these one-way video interviews and other ways that, what's with people who have a speech impairment? Will, the audio of their interviews be properly transcribed by the tools? That the computer then infers how successful you will be at a given job. So that's a concern. What is with people who have accents? Will the transcription tool actually accurately transcribe the words that they say, and then will the AI tool make fair decisions? So what the companies tell me is that candidates have to meet a certain threshold before the AI would score someone. I don't know what the threshold is. But I assumed, okay, well, let's test it a little bit. So one of the tests I did for a audio and video interview, I tested two companies, was one time I wasn't in front of the camera in a video interview, and I deep faked my answers. So I was just typing my answers, and I had trained a deep fake to just generate my voice. And I got a 75% match for the role. So the computer didn't even recognize that there was no human in front of the camera, which actually the FBI put out a note last summer that this is actually a security problem for a lot of companies, that they haven't even built in the minimum standards that we actually see in I'm not trying to say that facial recognition software is good, but most of them have something built in that you have to actually show that there's a face and somebody is moving. But that wasn't even there. And then with some of the tools, I tried to test it myself, and I did think about why don't I speak to it in German? Because I'm never going to meet the minimum threshold. Because I speak German, tool's not going to understand it, so probably going to get an error message, like I did when I just did silence. And so I tested this tool, and it was interesting that I did get a result. And I should say I first answered all the questions in English. And this was a tool that was marketed to companies in the West who want to hire call center employees in the global south, and one of the criteria is how well do they speak English. So when I answered everything in English, I got an 8.5 out of 9, English competent, and then I tried to speak to it in German, and here's what we talked about on a podcast.
So, Hilke, you also tried speaking German to my interview, and you got a score there too.
I did get a score, but first I got a transcript of what I said.
Okay, so this is what it interpreted your words to be. And I'm just going to read from the transcript here, which does not make a lot of sense. So, humidity is a desk, a beat up. Sociology does it iron. Mind material, nematode adapt. Secure location, Masons the first half gamma their fortunes in.
Yep, it's gibberish.
Okay, what results did you get from this?
I was scored a 73% match for the role, although I didn't speak a word of English, and the things I said in German had nothing to do with the questions I was asked or with the job itself.
Because you were reading a German Wikipedia page.
Yeah, actually, 73% is pretty high. And I wanted to make sure this language discovery was just not based on me speaking German. So one of the graduate students who I work with was kind enough to record herself in Chinese reading the same Wikipedia text. She scored 80%, and her English transcript is gibberish just like mine.
Right, bringing us back once again to this question of, are these machines making decisions based on scientific evidence, or are they just guessing?
Yep, that's the elephant in the room. And as journalists, we always go back before publication to any of the companies and talk to them and say, like, here's what we found out. Would you like to comment? You know, maybe we did something wrong, right? We want to make sure everything is accurate. So I called one of the companies and got their permission to record our little
Before
chat.
we go, we want you to know we told the companies behind the systems we tested about what we did and about our results. And this is what we heard back. Curious Thing AI thanked us for testing their system. My interview did too, and they also got on the phone with us to talk about what we found.
It knows that you weren't speaking English, for sure.
Clayton Donnelly is my interview's industrial organizational psychologist.
But then it defaults to audio only. Then it won't use your content. Because the content you can see, it's like, it's random. It's random nonsense. So it won't read that at all unless we tell it to do that.
So you were saying it didn't take the transcript at all into consideration, just the intonation of my voice. And I scored a 73% match. Like the intonation of my voice was a 73% match with the role.
Yeah, well done.
So I want to just share a couple more of examples. Somebody said that I don't know if you remember, this is like a gamified assessment that is trying to find out, sort of what are some of your personality traits, and it was calibrated by folks who are currently in the role. So maybe you have like 50 accountants at your job, and you want to hire new accountants. They play this game, and whatever they behaviors have that are different from the regular population, this is what the AI tool will look at. So this game, I'm just going to play for a second. It's called I call it the balloon game. I don't know if that's the scientific game for it. So you have to pump up a balloon. And you have to collect the money before it explodes. And, the idea is to make as much money, I think. I don't know what really the intention is. But this is supposedly testing my risk behavior, like my propensity for risky behavior. And, there are a couple of questions. While I was playing this game, I was like, wait a sec. I had this meta thing going on in my head. I was like, what are they trying to do? Like, why am I supposed to pump or not pump? Like, that was kind of weird. But also the question was like, I was like, is this actually, maybe I'm like a devil in video games, but does this actually translate into being a risk taker at work or in real life? I'm not sure. And then the other question I had was, does risk taking actually have anything to do with the job? Because we've come to a consensus over the last few decades that, we shouldn't hire people because of their skin color or, the way they look or the way they talk. We should really hire them for like their skills, their experience, can they do the job versus all the other things that we as humans bring to the table. And I think that's really a question here. we also, when I talked to some experts about this, they were also really worried that the tool was built based only on people who are currently in the role who are successful. And they said, we had misfires with this before because we tried this once, figuring out like, why are these nurses at one hospital, what makes them really good, the successful ones good at their job? So they did a little bit of an assessment test and found out that the nurses who are really good at their job, they're all very compassionate compared to the general population. And they're like, yeah, we need to, anyone would now assume we should really find compassionate nurses because those are the people that are successful here. Well, it turns out when they looked at the people who are unsuccessful employees, they were also compassionate, more than the general population, because it turns out, apparently, in this particular hospital, a lot of people, healthcare workers, are more compassionate than the general population. So it turns out when they did some more tests, they found out that it's conscientiousness that made the successful nurses successful at this particular hospital. And one last example from these games, I played a game together with someone who actually has a disability, because I think folks with disabilities are really at risk for some of these AI tools, because they look for like the statistical significance. And a lot of people, first of all, people who have a disability are underrepresented in the workforce, so they're probably not represented in the training data. But then they also may have to play some of these kind of tests. So here, this is the same gamified assessment, one of the other games. And here you have to do a hard task and an easy task. So here I'm reading it, and then it asks you, do you want to do a hard task or an easy task? I think I chose I chose a hard task. And then the job is to repeatedly fill the bar and complete the task. You just have to hit the space bar as fast as possible. So when I was playing this with somebody who has a disability, Henry Claypool, he was really worried. He was like, wait, what if I have a motor disability and I can't move my hands as fast? Like, will I get rejected? And he was also like, wait a second. And I had the same question, like, what does hitting the space bar as fast as possible have to do with any job, right? Like, I've never had a job that I had to do that. So there are a lot of questions around these tools, and I think folks with disabilities, we really have to take a much closer look, because they're not represented in the training data. And even if there would be, there's real questions here, because disabilities are expressed so individually that even maybe somebody who has autism was in the training data, but the next applicant who maybe has autism, their autism may be represented in a very different way. So those are some of the things I picked up while going through the world of AI hiring tools. And I do this work because to me, hiring matters. Like, it matters who gets a job. Most of us need money and need to work to have a roof over our head and feed our children. And, having a job is kind of a big deal, at least to most applicants. When I had to do job interviews, I was really nervous because it mattered if I get the job or not. And, a lot of us also feel like, if you have a good job, there's a lot of your identity and happiness connected to it. So if I was a job applicant and I would find out that my application was rejected because I was not the most qualified person, I would be sad. But I could live with that. But I would be really upset if I would find out that, a faulty algorithm who kicked me out because I had softball on my resume that had nothing to do with the job, I would be really upset. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. That's it. And here are just put a little summary on how to hold AI accountable.
Thank you so much, Hilke. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming as well. Thank you for doing all the hard work of bringing all this stuff to light. Talking about hiring, selecting people for work, selecting people to come work with us in teams, isn't that a biased activity too? How do we sort of square human bias with AI bias? In other words, what's the path forward of balancing those two? in the realm of hiring? You need to push a button.
Push a button. It's old school. So I think it's a great question. And I think, a lot of people have said that like, oh, we don't want to go back to biased traditional hiring. And I absolutely agree. Hiring managers, humans, they hire people based if they had like a bad day or they are hungry. They hire different people based on chit chat. We went to the same school. Oh, it's great. Now I see you differently. So I'm not trying to go back to that. But I'm trying to say, like, let's not use the historic bias from humans and build them into the systems and now have a veneer of objectivity and mathematical precision when it's just the same bias built in. And another threat I have with these tools is like, I do feel that like one human hiring manager can do a lot of harm to a lot of people, but they can only hire so many people and discriminate against them in 1 year or so. But, these algorithms, the scope is just unprecedented. So if you think about like a large company that gets 3 million applications, if they have a faulty algorithmic tool that scans all of those resumes and rejects mostly women, they might have now discriminated against hundreds of thousands of people. So the scope is unprecedented. And, we really see again and again that these biases are built into these systems.
Thank you for that. We know that the HR tech industry is growing. And I wonder, what are the sort of trends you see? You shared earlier that, a micro-expression analysis, we thought we were done with that. It's back. What is sort of happening in that industry right now, especially as we now have generative AI everywhere?
Yeah. I mean, I think the companies are a little bit slow to adapt to generative AI. I think actually generative AI has been really helpful for job seekers, because I think a lot of job applicants have felt really helpless over the last few years because, you send your resume out, you don't even know what's happening to it. You probably don't even get a rejection email. Who knows what happens. But now with generative AI, I think there's a little bit power back to the applicants, because you can use ChatGPT to help you polish your resume. Some folks use it to write a cover letter. And some folks online have like joked with me like, oh, it's AI against AI. May the better tool win. Like they know that a lot of companies use AI, right? And maybe this is the death of the cover letter, which should have happened years ago. But also folks use generative AI to understand, what are the most commonly asked questions in job interviews. Maybe what are the most commonly used answers. Maybe finally we have good answers to what are your strengths and weaknesses. I think also we see in HR tech, like some of the trends are, we see some companies going to skills-based hiring, and I think that's actually a pretty good development. So we don't look at like whether, we're not even going to look whether you have a bachelor's degree, and we certainly are not going to look about at which schools you went to, because that might actually say more about your socioeconomic background than your qualifications to get to that school. So skills-based hiring, we see companies that use sort of big data to infer, okay, we have all of these skills in our workforce. What do we need to do next? Who can be trained for the next big thing? I think that's a really good development. But there's a little bit of a but that unfortunately we see this also being used in hiring, and your keywords on your resume, maybe you put Python on your resume, and the problem is like I as a hiring manager and also an AI tool wouldn't know, like, are you very proficient? Did you just take a class? No one knows, right? So we might be inferring skills that people are not really have. So
Thank you for that take. I'm going to take a cue from what you said earlier. It may help applicants. So we have a lot of our students here. We as professionals are also affected by AI in hiring and AI in the workplace. What are some tips you can share with us, especially with our students, with regards how to approach an AI penetrated hiring space?
Yeah. So I've learned a little bit some things along the way as I was doing this kind of research. And I should caution it a little bit that I don't know exactly how every AI tool was calibrated or tuned, right? Like I have no idea which resumes were used to train every individual tool, but some tools are also like off the shelf tools and they're pretty broad. So I think one thing that I always tell people now is like, people used to give everyone the advice with like, oh, use your resume to stand out, make it like colorful, 2 columns, and like none of that. You have to make it like super boring, machine readable, short, crisp sentences, no 2 columns. I also suggest to have a skills section because what we've seen actually some AI tools or even algorithmic tools have like a hard time to actually taking your work experience and putting it in the right little pocket of the spreadsheet where it gets into. So I would suggest to have like a big skill section so that gets transferred. And there's a couple of tools online that you can use where you can upload a job description, upload your resume, and sort of generally understand what would a general AI to infer, because it looks often at the words, the keywords that you use, and sort of how much does it match with your resume. You want to shoot for a 60 to 80% match. Don't shoot for a 100% match, because then the AI will infer that you just copied the job description. So you don't want to do that. So short, crisp sentences, anything you can quantify. So you made a company $5 million, put that in there. You supervise a team of 10 people, like anything that's quantifiable. If you have a license, put that in there. If you have a license number, put that even in there. So I think that might be helpful. And if your resume sounds boring or written for a machine, you can always bring like a more exciting resume to a job interview, right? Because what happens is like we see a lot of AI tools at the beginning of the hiring funnel. So for like resume screening, one-way video interviews, and usually at the end, there's still a human that will have a job interview with you. And and just bring a new resume to them.
Thank you for sharing those. I'm going to ask my last question, and then it's all you with questions and comments. And I want to zoom out a little bit. We are in the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and we are in a very important year for democracy, at least in the United States. So my question for you is, how does this relate to democracy? Are there threats to democracy? How we relate to one another? How we organize ourselves democratically as a society? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have some like really high level thoughts on that I think, we really have a problem if AI tools are being built and used by large corporations who will use it to their benefit. And I think we see that in hiring and in the workplace that, it's not really used a lot to train workers and maybe help workers. It's more used in like sort of a punitive way. Like we have, computer programs that check every keystroke, take photos of you every minute if you're really at your desk. They check your sentiment in emails and send that to legal. That doesn't sound like it's like a helpful thing, saying like, oh, maybe you need to check in with your colleagues. Have you like taken a walk? Like we see a little bit of that, but not a whole lot. So I think that threatens democracy because we as the public, we don't know a lot about it, right? Like in this case, especially in hiring, we don't actually really know what companies use. Also with technology at work, we don't know a lot. And because there is no need to publish that or tell that with anyone. So that's actually another tip is like anything that happens on a work computer in the United States really does belong to the company. Most of it, that's sort of based on case law that we've seen in the courts. So I always suggest to people like do stuff on your phone. Maybe some people have a second computer at their desk. If you want to, do other things, don't do that on the work computer because you never know what is being recorded. And sometimes the data is just recorded, but if some signal comes up that maybe you're updating your LinkedIn too often, or you're putting USB sticks in the computer and moving files, that could all be signals to tools that maybe you're about to leak some information, and somebody might take a closer look. So I do think that is part of democracy, that we need to know more. We need to have transparency on these tools.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, we're going to start our Q&A session. So any questions you have, we have one here, two.
New York City passed the country's first law forcing companies to disclose whether they're using algorithms and had stipulations about them needing to be audited, et cetera. Enforcement has been a little squishy because it's been mostly like very broad language around how companies do it, and it's really just self-enforced, which means they're not doing it at all. Have you been following that is the question? And then if so, do you have any thoughts about how policy can be updated to put a little bit more teeth into legislation?
Yeah, I think we've seen the thing that, like, a lot of people were really excited about this law in New York City that was going to mandate that companies that use AI tools or algorithmic tools in hiring have to audit their tools every year, and they have to make that audit public. And I think we've seen 18 companies comply with the law and putting those audits online. They're also often very basic audits. They look for gender, men versus women, and they look for 5 racial categories. They don't look for intersection, often like, maybe Black women versus white men, where we actually see a lot of the biases creep in. And I think that's another problem of the law. So yeah, the law is not enforced. So what we need is a couple of things. I think we need definitely more transparency. And we need actually transparency, not only that AI is being used, because I think a lot of job applicants and people at work, we're sort of forced consumers, right? I don't really get a choice. If I want the job, you tell me I have to do a video interview, I'm going to probably do it. I really want the job. So we're forced to use that technology. So I think transparency to understand how was I scored, and maybe even having an appeals process. So I sometimes think about credit scoring. It's a flawed system, but I can check my credit score for free once a year, and I can see how I was scored, and I can appeal that process. But with hiring and with technology at work, we know nothing. So I think that would be a good way. Some regulation might also be helpful, and then I think there needs to be way more tech journalists, civil society to test these tools. But sometimes I also dream about maybe we should build some of these tools and actually sort of put it in the public interest to be like, okay, here's a resume screener that we built, and we have verified that it does not use bias variables. Why don't you use this tool versus that tool? Because I think in the HR tech space, a lot of startups and vendors, they need to get to market. Like, they have so much pressure to make the money back. And, science takes time. So it would take years to verify some of these tools, right? We need to have longitudinal studies, which I would love to do. But I haven't found a company that wants to do it. But I think that would be much more helpful.
Did the companies that use this stuff realize how shoddy it can actually be?
Yes. Some of them do, but the way I describe it, it's sort of like a little bit of a cloak of silence here. So I've talked to some HR managers who are like, oh, yeah, we used that gamified assessment for a couple of years. We had the same questions that you had, and then we quietly stopped using it. And actually, I talked to one employment lawyer who tested a gamified assessment in a pilot study. So when a vendor comes in and wants to start do business with a big company, some big companies mandate due diligence and bring in folks. And he said that in the pilot phase, the gamified assessment kept discriminating against women, and they just couldn't change it. So the company didn't use the vendor, went with another vendor. But he was like, oh, yeah, the startup is still around and they're big now. And so the question is, like, does anything ever change? Because I sort of understand that vendors maybe don't want to talk about publicly that they have a problem with their technology, but the companies that use these tools and then maybe abandon it or test it and they find problems in it also don't want to talk about it because they feel that, they might be liable, right? Like, if they use this tool for 2 years and they hired 10,000 people and interviewed 100,000 people, suddenly, and they come out and say like, oh yeah, we had a gender discrimination problem, all these people might file a class action lawsuit. So I think there isn't a whole lot of transparency, which we desperately need.
Thank you for that. I'm going to chime in. I see all the hands on the regulation question. So anti-discrimination legislation and sort of giving that teeth in the AI context is one thing. The FTC has also been very interested in this through the lens of consumer protection and the question, can these tools actually deliver what they say they can? So that's another interesting regulatory space to observe in this context here. But I saw some hands up. 1 and then 2.
Oh, and I can also say that I think it's kind of interesting to see that the National Labor Relations Board, an interesting small agency that looks at union activity in the US, is also starting to look at some of the monitoring at work because they feel union activity in the United States is protected, and workers are allowed to talk about unions and that they want to maybe band together. And the problem is that with some of these AI tools that monitor everything, some of that protected speech, I guess, could be known to the company, which would be illegal. So I think there might be some pushback here.
Recently, as in probably yesterday, maybe a little bit before, University of Michigan has announced that they were offering data sets of speech or vocal events collected around campus from talks, classroom discussions, office hour conversations, etc., compiling those together and then selling them to people building LLMs for training data. They've done the same thing with academic papers and made collections of these things with very accurate transcripts from the audio and then supporting graphics and things for the papers and such. And apparently the goal is to provide more effective training data for some of these companies that are interested in doing this. Yeah. I'm curious whether this is something that you've seen emerging and what your thoughts are.
I mean, we saw OpenAI use anything on the internet, right, as training data, like all kinds of audio and written language. And, they talk about like low quality text that is also being used, and that sort of makes the LLM less good. So yeah, I mean, I think we've seen it, like YouTube is a large repository of spoken words that is being used to train tools. So I'm not shocked that the university would try to sell that. I think there is obviously questions about consent and the privacy of our data, right? And I think I've did this, it's sort of like a little bit in the book, I a little bit speak about it, how some of maybe health AI tools are moving into work. So in this case, I looked at a vocal biomarker that was used by a university during the pandemic, where students could speak like 30 seconds a day, like, how are you doing? And then the tool would tell you back if you're anxious or depressed and what you can do to help yourself. And I think, we see more and more of that critical voice data that I feel like that's the only instrument we have to communicate. And I cannot, get out of that. If I want to talk about my book or want to talk about the world, I have to use my voice. And so many different things can be used on top of my voice or can be sold. And I think we have to have a whole lot of questions about consent, privacy, and are people okay with this?
Thank you. So building on that, speaking of privacy, we don't have a national privacy law, a privacy bill or law. And so when thinking of the bias, privacy forms a core part of this. How do you see the pathway forward? Or how do you see that we have the GDPR in EU, the US doesn't have one. What is the pathway forward?
Yeah, I mean, how is the data being stored, and especially some of the things that HireVue and other companies did, right, with the facial expression analysis, the intonation of your voice, that feels like very intimate data that they have. And unfortunately, I think not all the companies and vendors have very strong guardrails around it, because we've seen, like a couple of weeks ago, a hacker collective hacked into a AI hiring chatbot and found out personal data and sent random people notices that they were hired. So clearly these were large Fortune 500 companies that use this. So clearly this wasn't well guarded. So I think there's a huge problem there. I mean, would we love to have an omnibus bill like the general data protection law like the Europeans have? Totally. And in fact, it's been really helpful for my book, because some people in Europe were able to petition some of the companies for their data, and they have to get the data back. So that was helpful for the reporting. So my hope is, and I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but we sometimes see in regulatory compliance, if one state, and often in the United States it's California, which has a lot of people, right? So if California has very strict emission regulations for cars, usually what car makers do is they will build car with really good emissions that will pass the regulatory hurdles in California and will pass it in the rest of the United States as well, because there's less regulation. So my hope is maybe we'll have a state like California have a little bit more regulation, and then all the other state, all the AI tools will be ready for the other states. But I'm not sure if that's actually happening.
Thank you so much for the talk. It sounds like you did a lot of, I'll call it legwork with the companies, asking a ton of questions. I'm curious, and I'm guessing these are closely guarded secrets, but do you have any favorite stories of sources of training data that companies are using for these models?
So I think most of the companies actually use data on from their current employees. And I don't think there's a lot of consent. I think it's just like, you gave us your resume. Now we're going to use the resume to train the next model. And I actually, and this happened a bunch of times that some companies did, and organizations did like pilot studies on AI and hiring, and they used HireVue's AI tool. And I was like, oh, did you disclose that to applicants? Because when I talked to applicants who applied here for a job, they didn't know that AI was used on them. They thought a HR manager was watching this, and they were like, oh no, it's just a pilot phase, so we didn't have to disclose. And I'm like, oh, I mean, so we're not using this to make decisions, but it was like, but you're storing their facial expressions and their data I'm sure some companies do disclose that in the fine print, but I think it's sort of the same thing with like the forced consumerism, right? Like it's the same thing when I start a job, and some companies will tell you on the first day, here's your Google Drive, and just so you know, we may monitor this. Like, are you going to say no and walk out the door? Probably not. And maybe you'll forget that this may be happening until, IT investigates you.
Thank you. We have our last one question, then you'll have the last word.
So I was just wondering if you've seen AI being.
Yes. So we've seen that some companies now use AI tools as maybe part of layoff decisions and firing decisions. And I think, it's often people that do work in hourly positions, maybe have the least power. So I think we've seen this a lot in like warehouses, drivers, they're very closely monitored. And actually, some delivery drivers have cameras in their vans that actually check their facial expressions and not only where they're driving to, right? And, there's closely ranked like satisfactory scores, like how many packages did you deliver? Did you deliver all the packages? And we see that, once you go under a certain threshold, you will be reprimanded by these companies and be fired. And actually in some of the warehouses, we also know that there's, productivity rates that you have to like put so and so many things in the package every hour or so. And, it's actually kind of funny. It's a disclosure for the National Labor Relations Board, where one of the companies, somebody who was trying to start a union was fired. And the company said, no, they weren't fired for union activities. They were fired because they went under the productivity threshold, under the productivity algorithmic threshold. And I was like, wow, they actually disclosed that because they wanted to say we didn't hire them for union activities. But they incidentally disclosed that they are using this to reprimand people. So we're seeing more and more of that. And I don't think the software is laid out to understand individual differences. Like, maybe your dad died this week and maybe you weren't so productive. I don't think a software can take that into account at all. So we're seeing more and more on that. And I think some of the monitoring technology was already around, but the pandemic obviously pushed it into overdrive, where a lot of people started working from home. And, a lot of managers got freaked out and wanted to know, like, are these people actually working? So they installed the software. And I think what happens often, once you have a software installed, it's kind of hard to get rid of it because it's kind of there. And maybe it's convenient to look at it and check how productive people are. And I do think the productivity measure is also a wrong measure. Like often it measures like how long are we at our desk, right? I don't know if that is really measuring how well you perform your job. It just measures that you're sitting at your desk and you move your mouse, right? Like it's not actually, I don't actually know if you're really good at your job.
Speaking of, and then you'll have the last word, we have a productivity score through our Outlook here at UVA. You may get regular emails on your productivity. Last word.
Well, thank you so much for your fantastic talk, and I really enjoy it. So I feel like you're talking about like the negative consequences of using AI for the hiring process. For example, like the qualified candidates may be filtered by faulty algorithms, or like disabilities may be like very disadvantaged in the hiring process. So I'm just curious. So, do you have a ideal way for companies to use AI during the hiring process in mind, even though it's not realistic so far?
Use
Is
AI.
there a good way of using
Yeah.
AI, right? Like
Is there a good way of using AI?
in hiring.
In your perfect world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what I'm trying to do is like sort of have a larger conversation, like how should we hire? We don't want to use biased human hiring. We don't want to use bad AI tools. So can we build better tools, but can we also like actually think through like what does hiring mean in a way? Like we have so many people, hiring is really bad. So many people quit, right? And I think one of the things is like we look at one thing, maybe at your personality in these gamified assessments, and then we reject you. But really, like humans can adapt. Can we also check how good you are at your skills that you already bring to the table? Can we have an interview and have structured questions back for like behavioral questions, like how did you overcome some problems, and have a more holistic approach to hiring? I also sometimes feel it's a little bit unfair because we hire and test individuals, but we actually bring them into a team. And if you have, probably everyone had like a horrible manager before, you can be the best, most qualified employee. If you come into a bad team, you're not going to be successful, right? There's all kinds of things that are part of a hiring decision that I think we should actually really think about, like what works and what doesn't. And also maybe understand that there is a limit how much we can predict the future. And that is a limit to AI, and that is a limit to humans as well. And sort of think through like, okay, how can we make this more fair and more holistic than just one little thing? And I think one thing that I'm sort of thinking, maybe this will be a good thing, is I felt like when I did all this research, I really feel for job applicants who have to do an assessment every time they apply for a job. You have to show your coding skills or your writing skills, and you do it again and again. It takes a lot of time. And I kind of felt like, well, couldn't we have like our skills on the blockchain and like do one assessment, and it's like secure on a server, and then every company can just go back to that and be like, oh yeah, she knows Python, like she did this test, so you don't have to redo everything. And you can also appeal to this, right? There needs to be an appeals process because maybe they got the wrong Hilke to do this, or they got the names confused. So I think that could be really interesting, and you could do more of that. So I think some of this algorithmic tools could be really helpful. I think the money right now is in selling it to large companies who use it in the ways that I sort of describe. But I think there could be really a way that we can make hiring better for everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Hilke. Thank you. Karsh Institute of Democracy, Media Studies Department, thank you. There's cookies and things outside. There are also books to buy outside. Hilke will sign them.
Yeah, I'm happy to sign.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.